started with module 1, and we're going to recap on some risk basics in order to make sure that we have a common understanding of risk. And that's important because risk analysis is something that we do every day. Every time you cross the road, every time you make a big purchase, every time you decide whether you're going to travel to something or maybe just look it up online instead, you're making risk analysis decisions all the time, probably without even realizing it. But we need something a little bit more formal than the instinctive thinking about risk that we do all the time. And to help us do that, we need just a couple of definitions to get us started. So first of all, what is a risk? Well, it's a combination of the severity of a mishap or accident and the probability that that mishap will occur. So it's a combination of two things, and we'll see that illustrated in the next slide. Secondly, we've talked about this mishap. What is it? So it's an event or a series of events, and we'll come on to that again, resulting in unintentional death, injury, occupational illness, damage to or loss of equipment or property, or damage to the environment. So in the particular standard we're looking at today, it's covering quite a lot of things, harm to things. And that's why we're focused on safety. And as it says, for the purposes of the standard that we're looking at, the term mishap includes negative environmental impacts from planned events. So we are, even if it's deliberate, if it does harm to the environment, we want to include that as well as a mishap, as an undesirable event, if you like. Okay, so I said that risk was defined as probability and severity, and here we've got a little illustration of that. So probability, how likely is this thing to go wrong? How likely is this thing to happen? And severity, what's the magnitude of this event, varying from death, injury, illness, property damage or equipment loss, damage to the environment, or monetary loss. And to be honest, we can define risk any way we want. So it doesn't have to be a safety risk. We could be thinking about financial risk, a reputational risk, whatever it might be. But what you see there with the little matrix is we measure risk, and whether we say risk is high, medium, or low, or whatever scheme we use, a combination of high severity and high likelihood is going to result in high risk, whereas at the opposite end of the scale, the low probability that a low impact event is going to happen, we would call that a low risk. So that's what we mean by this combination of probability and severity. We put them together and we can measure risk in, to be honest, whatever way we choose to do so. This is just a very simple example. Okay. Now in safety, we have an additional concept that gives us a much finer degree of control over how we are thinking about risk. So we have these things, or this concept of hazards, okay? So as it says, a hazard is a real or potential condition that could lead to a mishap, okay? So it's not the mishap, it's a sort of an intermediate stage, as we will see. And obviously the mishap can result in death, injury, property damage, damage to the environment. And then there's also these things called causal factors or causes. And it might be one or several mechanisms that could trigger the hazard or lead to the hazard, which in turn can lead to the mishap. So the causal factor or the cause can trigger the hazard, and then the hazard can lead to the mishap. Okay, let's look at that. So here we have an illustration of an accident sequence or a mishap sequence if you prefer. Let's not get hung up on terminology. Okay, so we may have a number of causal factors on the left-hand side of this bow tie diagram, and any one of these factors may lead to a particular hazard, a single hazard we're looking at here, and then that hazard may lead to a number of different consequences. Now, not all of these consequences are going to be bad. Not all of them are going to result in a mishap. There may be lots of consequences where there is no mishap, no accident, no harm whatsoever. Okay, there's going to be a range of possible consequences. Okay, so what I would like us to take away from this diagram is this thought that, yeah, we can have causes leading to a hazard, this sort of pinch point in the middle, and then from that hazard, a number of consequences can arise. Okay, now that's important, and it's a very powerful concept because it really does help us to reason about accident sequences and to do some much more sophisticated work than would otherwise be possible. So just to help us, there's 3 tests that I know of for a hazard. 2 of them are really, the first 2 are saying the same thing in slightly different ways. So we can think of a hazard as being both necessary and sufficient for harm to occur. So we need the hazard to be present before harm can occur, but the hazard is enough for harm to occur. Another way of saying that is that once the hazard is present, nothing else unusual needs to happen for harm to occur. So once the hazard is there, nothing else needs to go wrong for somebody to get hurt, let's say. Okay, it could just be normal events that lead to the mishap once the hazard is present. A further thing that I've heard, which I think is helpful, an accident, a hazard is an accident waiting to happen. And then the third on this list, we can think of a hazard at the point of which we lose control of something. And it might be an energy source that we lose control of. It might be something toxic. It might be a physical piece of equipment that we've lost control of, or a vehicle. It might be a substance, whatever it might be. We've lost control, and now somebody could get hurt. Okay, so those are some tests for a hazard, some different ways of thinking about it. But I always think it's helpful to have an example. So let's imagine we've got a causal factor. We've got some oil that is leaked from its container, or is leaking from its container. And we can imagine the hazard. The oil has got onto a walkway or a pavement or a sidewalk, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so this is an area that human beings would, walk on, as the name implies. That's perfectly normal. So once the oil is on the walkway, nothing else unusual needs to happen for there to be an accident. Okay, but it doesn't make the accident inevitable. Okay, because if nobody comes along, there can be no accident. If somebody comes along, but they see the oil and they step over it and avoid it, or even better, they warn other people about it and clear it up, but that's another story. But so the accident, the mishap, is not inevitable. Some of the range of combinations that is possible is that we get a mishap. A person comes along, doesn't see the oil, steps on it, slips, and hurts themselves. Okay, so all of those things have to happen in a sequence, in this accident sequence, for the mishap to occur. Okay, for people to get hurt. So there we have a little summary of those risk concepts that we need to get a hold of. So we've covered risk and mishap. We've covered probability and severity, excuse me. We've covered hazards and causal factors. We've looked at the mishap or accident sequence, and we've looked at hazards, and we've looked at some tests for what constitutes a hazard. You know, how do we tell in the sequence between cause, hazard, and consequence where the hazard is? And we've looked at an example. Okay, so this module, we aim to have a common understanding of risk, which will form the foundation for everything that we're going to do with risk from now on. Okay, let's move on to module